Hello, my dear masterminds. They assumed you were passive because nothing about your behavior demanded immediate attention. You weren't rushing to respond. You weren't filling silence. You weren't competing for airtime or asserting urgency. To people who confuse motion with intelligence, that reads as absence, they mistook stillness for emptiness. What they didn't see was the processing happening underneath. While they were reacting to moments, you were tracking sequences. While they were focused on what was being said, you were noticing how often it was repeated, who benefited from it. And when it stopped lining up with reality, you weren't waiting, you were reading. Patterns don't reveal themselves to people who need instant feedback. They emerge to those who let situations breathe long enough to expose structure. You gave them that space without announcing it. Every pause wasn't hesitation, it was calibration. Every moment of quiet wasn't disengagement, it was data collection. They kept mistaking your restraint for compliance because compliance is familiar. Passivity fits inside their model. Analysis doesn't. They assumed you weren't moving because they couldn't see movement. What they missed is that the most consequential shifts don't happen on the surface. They happen when someone stops reacting long enough to understand the system that's producing the reactions. That's what you were doing in real time. And the longer they underestimated you, the clearer the pattern became. They kept talking because silence makes people uncomfortable. They kept explaining because explanation feels like command. Every word they added made the structure clearer to you. Not the content, the rhythm. Who spoke when pressure appeared? Who rushed to fill gaps? Who repeated themselves when challenged? Who changed tone when authority entered the room? You weren't interested in opinions. Opinions fluctuate. You were watching behavior under pressure, because behavior reveals rules. Real-time pattern analysis doesn't look active from the outside. It looks disengaged. That's why they relaxed. That's why they revealed more than they intended. They assumed you weren't tracking sequence, escalation, contradiction. They assumed you were simply present. And presence without reaction reads as harmless to people who need reaction to feel relevant. Meanwhile, you were mapping cause and effect as it unfolded. Not guessing, not predicting, observing. You saw how small incentives redirected conversation, how pressure shortened attention spans, how certainty gave way when challenged indirectly. None of that required intervention. It required patience. They believed influence lived in response speed. You understood it, lived in response accuracy. And accuracy only comes after enough information accumulates. That's why you didn't interrupt. That's why you didn't counter. You let the system speak until it exposed its own limits. As time passed, their assumption hardened into confidence. Confidence is what makes people careless. They stopped guarding their language. They stopped coordinating their positions. They began contradicting themselves without noticing, because they believed there was no one in the room assembling the full picture. They thought they were dealing with someone slow, or disengaged, or uninterested. They didn't realize that passivity was only their projection. What you were doing required more effort than reacting ever would. You were holding multiple threads at once, tracking who aligned with whom only when certain topics appeared, noticing which arguments resurfaced whenever leverage shifted, watching how people behaved when they thought the outcome was already decided. Real-time analysis isn't dramatic. It's cumulative. Each moment adds weight until the pattern becomes undeniable. You weren't waiting for a signal to act. You were waiting for certainty, and certainty doesn't announce itself with urgency. It arrives quietly, when enough variables stop changing. That's when the advantage settles in. They never saw it happen because they weren't watching for stillness to mean anything. They were watching for movement. And by the time movement finally came from you, it wasn't a reaction. It was resolution. That resolution didn't come with force. It came with precision. When you finally spoke or moved, it wasn't exploratory. It wasn't testing waters. It landed exactly where the structure was most vulnerable point, because you'd already mapped it. To them, it felt sudden. To you, it felt overdue. That's the difference between reaction and analysis. Reaction responds to pressure. Analysis waits until pressure exposes its own seams. They were stunned not because you acted, but because your action required no adjustment afterward. It didn't create confusion, it brought coherence. The room recalibrated instantly, like a system recognizing a correct input. That's when uncertainty replaced their earlier confidence. They tried to understand how someone they'd written off as passive could move with such accuracy. They replayed the timeline in their heads, searching for the moment you changed. They missed the truth. You never changed. You were accumulating information the entire time. Their mistake wasn't underestimating your speed. It was misunderstanding your process. They thought intelligence announces itself through constant output. You showed them it can operate quietly, invisibly, until the exact moment it needs to surface. And once it does, there's no need for follow-up. The work is already done. That's when the narrative around you stopped holding together, not publicly, internally. The story they'd been telling themselves stopped working. Passive people don't land outcomes like that. Disengaged people don't resolve structures they never touched. So they searched for another explanation. Strategy, luck, timing, anything that preserved their original assumption. But none of it fit, because strategy leaves patterns. Luck leaves inconsistency. Timing leaves drift. What you created showed alignment. Clean, stable, settled. They realized then that passivity had never been your state. It was their misread. You weren't waiting for permission or momentum. You were letting the system finish revealing itself. And systems always reveal themselves to those who don't interfere too early. You didn't interrupt the process. You let it complete. That's why your move didn't create ripples. It brought resolution. People stopped arguing, not because they were convinced, but because there was nothing left to contest. The pattern had already resolved. And once a pattern resolves, resistance feels unnecessary. They didn't feel defeated. They felt exposed to their own assumptions, exposed for mistaking silence for lack of awareness, for assuming stillness meant absence of thought. You never needed to correct them. The result did it for you. After that, the environment adjusted without discussion. No one announced the shift. No one named what had happened. They simply started moving differently around you. Words became more careful. Decisions slowed just enough to regain precision. People checked themselves before assuming outcomes. Not because you demanded caution, but because they'd learned something about visibility. They realized that awareness doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it sits quietly, letting the picture finish forming before it intervenes. And once that lesson lands, it stays. They understood that your silence wasn't neutral. It was active in a way they weren't trained to recognize. You weren't absent. You were present at a depth they hadn't considered. That's why future interactions felt different. They couldn't rely on surface cues anymore. They knew someone was watching structure, not performance. And that knowledge alone reshapes behavior. You didn't need to dominate. You didn't need to explain. You'd already demonstrated a rare form of authority, the kind that operates invisibly until the moment it resolves everything. What unsettled them most wasn't the outcome. It was the realization that you'd been ahead the entire time without signaling it. People are comfortable losing to speed. They're comfortable losing to pressure. What they struggle with is realizing patience can outperform both. They started questioning their own instincts, wondering how often they'd mistaken silence for weakness elsewhere, how many patterns they'd missed because they were trained to reward motion. Your presence became a quiet constraint on their behavior. Not a threat, a reminder. Someone in the room is watching sequence, not spectacle. That alone changes how people speak, how they commit, how quickly they expose themselves. You didn't need to repeat the move. One clean resolution was enough to reset expectations. From then on, they stopped assuming the loudest person had the most awareness. They stopped believing urgency meant insight. They learned too late that analysis doesn't rush. It waits until the system reveals where it's fragile. And once that lesson is learned, it doesn't require reinforcement. It becomes reflex. What followed wasn't admiration, it was recalibration. People don't admire what exposes gaps in perception. They adjust around it. They stopped interpreting your quiet as indecision and started treating it as signal, not a signal you broadcast, but one they had to account for. You became the variable they couldn't model because you weren't reacting in the same time frame. While others operated on moments, you operated on arcs. While they measured success by immediate response, you measured it by whether the structure held after pressure passed. That's why your presence began to compress conversations. Less filler, fewer assumptions, more restraint. Not because you enforced standards, but because your analysis made shortcuts obvious. When someone sees patterns forming in real time, they don't need to speak often. They only need to wait until speaking becomes necessary. And when that happens, what's said carries weight. Not because of volume, but because it arrives complete. People realize then that passivity had never been your position. Observation was. And observation, when uninterrupted, outperforms reaction every time. That understanding settled in gradually. Then all at once, they stopped trying to draw you out, stopped testing silence with noise, stopped assuming engagement was required for influence to exist, because they saw what happens when someone observes without interference, long enough for reality to reveal its own logic. You weren't collecting facts. You were watching relationships between facts, cause linking to effect, pressure producing behavior, incentives reshaping language. And when you finally acted, it wasn't to win a moment. It was to close a pattern. That's why there was no aftermath to manage. No correction needed. No follow-up explanation. The outcome held. People realized that the most costly misread isn't confusing strength for weakness. It's confusing awareness for absence. You were present in every sense that mattered, just not where they were looking. And once that clicks, the room changes its posture toward you over time, not because you demand it, because they learned the cost of assuming you aren't paying attention. And the final realization lands quietly, without drama or resistance. They stop asking what you'll do next, because they understand now that your actions don't come from impulse or pressure. They come from completion. You don't move to gather information. You move when information has finished gathering itself. That's why your timing feels unsettling. It doesn't match urgency. It matches certainty. They finally see that passivity was never the absence of thought. It was the presence of discipline. Discipline to observe without interrupting. Discipline to wait without disengaging. Discipline to let patterns expose themselves fully before acting. Once that's understood, there's nothing left to challenge, no angle to test, no weakness to probe. The system adjusts around you because it recognizes a different operating depth. You weren't slower, you were deeper. And depth doesn't announce itself until the surface runs out of explanations. By the time they realized you'd been analyzing patterns in real time, the pattern was already closed. Nothing to revisit, nothing to debate, just a recalibration in how they read silence, stillness, and influence. That's the end of it. What never gets misread again is silence. Not yours, theirs. After this, people hesitate before assuming they're alone in their thinking. They pause before filling gaps, just to feel relevant. They slow down before mistaking stillness for surrender, because they learned something lasting. Awareness doesn't need motion to be active. Intelligence doesn't need volume to be present. And influence doesn't require reaction to exist. You didn't correct their assumption. You let it mature until it resolved on its own. That's why the shift held. It wasn't forced. It was learned. From that point forward, they don't scan you for cues. They scan themselves. They adjust their timing, their words, their confidence. Knowing someone might be reading the structure while they're busy performing inside it. You don't need to speak often now. The environment remembers what happens when you do, and that memory operates quietly, in advance, before mistakes are made. They assumed you were passive. They learned the cost of that assumption once. And this is where it settles. Not as a lesson people talk about, but as a rule they operate by. They don't replay the moment anymore. They don't analyze your behavior or try to decode what you're doing next. That urge fades, because decoding is for things that are still forming. What you demonstrated was already complete. They now understand that your quiet isn't empty space. It's depth. Depth that doesn't rush, doesn't leak, doesn't advertise. Depth that waits until reality finishes revealing itself, then moves once, cleanly. That's why nothing escalates after this. No rematch, no correction, no curiosity spiral. The system has learned. Silence can mean observation. Stillness can mean steadiness, and passivity can be the easiest misread of all. You don't carry this as a reputation. You carry it as an effect. People move differently because of it, often without realizing why. Not dominance that demands attention, but awareness that installs accuracy. They assumed you were passive. You were analyzing patterns in real time. And once that truth is seen clearly, it doesn't need to be proven again. It settles into behavior. Conversations shorten, assumptions thin out, shortcuts lose appeal. The room learns, without discussion, where precision lives and where noise stops working. What remains isn't tension, it isn't mystery, it's orientation. People don't think about you anymore when they enter similar situations. They feel you in the way they slow down before speaking, in the way they hesitate before assuming direction, in the way they watch patterns longer instead of rushing to dominate moments. Your presence reshaped how stillness is interpreted. Silence no longer reads as weakness. Waiting no longer reads as delay. Observation no longer reads as disengagement. Those old shortcuts stopped working. You didn't change how they see you. You changed how they see reality unfolding in front of them. And that's the deepest shift there is. Because it doesn't depend on memory. It doesn't fade with time. It installs itself into behavior. You never needed recognition for what you were doing. You let accuracy speak after the fact. And accuracy doesn't need repetition. Once it's felt, it becomes instinct. They assumed you were passive because they were measuring surface activity. You were operating underneath, where outcomes are decided before action becomes visible. Now they know, and knowing doesn't create drama. It creates restraint. That's where it ends. Not with applause, not with explanation. With a recalibration they carry forward into rooms you may never enter again. After that, there is nothing left to extract. No insight to mine, no angle to reverse. The system has already adjusted at the deepest level it can. You are no longer read as a participant. You are read as a condition, something that changes how moments unfold simply by being accounted for. People don't wonder what you're thinking anymore. They assume thinking is already happening somewhere beyond reach. They don't test silence. They respect it. They don't rush decisions. They slow them because they've learned what happens when patterns are allowed to finish forming. This isn't influence that needs maintenance. It's accuracy that holds without effort. You didn't assert intelligence. You revealed it by not interrupting reality while it was speaking. And once that lesson installs, it keeps working without you being present. Not a story that closes, a standard that remains. They assumed you were passive. You were never absent. You were already ahead, watching the structure take shape, waiting for the exact moment when nothing else needed to be said. And once that moment passed, everything else grew quiet. Hello, my dear masterminds. They thought you were just watching. That's the assumption they settled on early, and it made them comfortable. People relax when they believe they're being observed but not processed. Observation feels passive to them. It feels harmless. They assume nothing is being stored, nothing is being aligned, nothing is being prepared. They confuse stillness with absence. So they spoke freely, they moved carelessly, they revealed sequences they thought were invisible. And all the while, you weren't focused on what they were saying in isolation. You were tracking how one thing led to another, how timing exposed intent, how small inconsistencies repeated across different moments. You weren't collecting details. You were connecting them quietly, patiently, without interrupting the flow. Most people watch events. Very few watch relationships between events. That's the difference they missed. While they were busy managing impressions, you were mapping structure. While they reacted to what was loud, You noticed what stayed consistent when nothing dramatic was happening. You saw how the same behaviors resurfaced under different conditions, how pressure revealed the same tendencies, how incentives produced the same shifts, and you never rushed to name it, because naming too early interrupts the pattern before it finishes forming. You let it breathe. You let it repeat. You let it confirm itself. They mistook that patience for passivity. They believed you were disengaged. But disengagement doesn't sharpen perception. Distance does. And you created distance not by withdrawing, but by refusing to interfere. That's what allowed the threads to appear. One conversation connected to another. One decision echoed in a later contradiction. One reaction explained a choice made months earlier. They thought you were quiet because you had nothing to add. The truth was you were waiting for the picture to complete itself. And once a picture completes, it doesn't need commentary. It needs precision. That's why you didn't ask many questions. Questions disrupt flow. You let people talk until they revealed how they think, not just what they think. You watched where they hesitated, what they defended, unprompted, what they rushed to explain. Those are the threads most people miss, because they're too busy performing inside the moment. You stayed outside the moment long enough to see how moments connect. And when someone connects threads instead of reacting to noise, the entire dynamic changes. Because patterns reveal consistency, performances fluctuate. They assumed you were observing in real time, like everyone else. They didn't realize you were observing across time, linking past behavior to present posture, linking tone to outcome, linking silence to motive. That's why your stillness felt unfamiliar later. Not at first. At first it felt safe, familiar, easy to dismiss. But once they started noticing that your responses landed too accurately, that your timing felt deliberate, without being forced, something shifted. They couldn't figure out how you knew what you knew without being told. They didn't understand that you weren't reacting faster. You were concluding slower, and slower conclusions, when they're complete, are harder to dispute. You weren't guessing, you were integrating. That's what they failed to see. And by the time they sensed it, the threads were already connected. Once the threads connected, the room stopped behaving randomly around you. They didn't notice it at first, but the tone shifted. Conversations shortened, explanations became tighter. People began choosing their words with a level of care they didn't use before, not because you demanded precision, but because precision became necessary. They could feel that loose talk no longer passed unnoticed. You weren't reacting, but you were registering. And registration without reaction is stabilizing. It removes the feedback people rely on to adjust their performance. Most social behavior depends on micro-responses, nods, interruptions, approval signals, discomfort cues. You gave none of those. So people kept revealing themselves longer than they meant to. They filled silence, thinking it needed to be filled. They over-explained, thinking clarity would protect them. They repeated patterns, believing repetition made them invisible. And every repetition added another thread. You watched how confidence faded under mild pressure, how certainty softened when timelines were questioned, how values shifted when incentives changed. You noticed who stayed consistent and who recalibrated themselves mid-sentence. Those recalibrations told you more than anything spoken directly. Because people don't maintain consistency smoothly when adjusting in real time. You weren't looking for contradiction. You were watching alignment. Alignment between words and behavior. Alignment between past claims and present decisions. Alignment between how someone moved when no one was watching versus when attention returned, and slowly. Without announcement, you stopped treating moments as isolated events. You treated them as evidence points in a larger structure. That's what made your presence feel heavier later. Not emotionally, structurally. People sensed that actions now had continuity, that nothing reset just because the conversation ended. They assumed observation was temporary. You proved perception could be cumulative, and cumulative perception changes how systems behave. They started checking themselves before acting, not because you warned them, but because something about your silence suggested memory. Not emotional memory, pattern memory, the kind that tracks sequence, that notices inconsistency, that doesn't need accusation to stay accurate. You weren't building a narrative about them, you were building a model. And once someone realizes they're being modeled instead of judged, their behavior shifts in lasting ways. Because judgment can be managed, models can't. That's when they started misreading their own discomfort. They thought it was pressure. They thought it was influence. It wasn't. It was exposure to continuity. Most people are comfortable being seen in fragments. A moment here, a performance there. They rely on resets. New days, new rooms, new audiences. You removed the reset without saying a word. You carried sequence forward. What they said last week still mattered. How they acted yesterday still informed today. And that quiet carryover altered the dynamic. They couldn't rely on improvisation the same way anymore. Improvisation depends on amnesia. You didn't forget. Not emotionally. Structurally, you remembered how things connect. You noticed when someone praised a value they'd abandoned earlier, when someone claimed certainty but avoided consequence, when someone positioned themselves as consistent while quietly adjusting to advantage. None of it required confrontation. Confrontation would have broken the pattern. You let it finish forming. And because you didn't interrupt, people exposed their own through lines. They revealed what repeats when no one stops them. That's the thread most observers never see. They watch what's said. You watched what persists. Over time, that persistence became obvious even to them. They couldn't explain why your responses felt accurate without being aggressive. Why your silence felt informative without being judgmental. Why outcomes around you resolved faster, cleaner, with less drama. It wasn't because you controlled anything. It was because you waited until control was unnecessary. When someone connects invisible threads, they don't need to push. The structure resolves naturally. And once that happens, people don't argue with conclusions. They adjust to them. The realization didn't arrive as a shock. It arrived as recognition. They began to see that you were never behind the conversation. You were outside it. While they focused on winning moments, you were watching trajectories. While they reacted to tone, you tracked consequence. They mistook engagement for intelligence, and missed the intelligence that doesn't engage until it's finished mapping. You weren't slow to respond. You were refusing to respond to incomplete data. That's what separated you. Most people act to influence perception. You waited until perception stopped mattering. And once perception loses importance, influence fades with it. They noticed that when you finally spoke, nothing needed correction afterward. No backtracking, no clarification, no cleanup. The words landed and held, because they were attached to the structure, not the moment. People started to realize that you weren't processing what was happening. You were processing why it consistently happened this way. That depth affected them more than any open disagreement ever could. Open disagreement invites defense. Depth invites silence. They stopped trying to read your reactions and started watching their own behavior instead, because they could feel something was being seen, even if it wasn't being named. And once that feeling settles in a room, it rarely leaves. What finally clicked for them was simple, and it arrived after clarity had already formed. You weren't withholding response to appear composed. You weren't staying quiet to gain advantage. You genuinely didn't need to intervene early, because intervention wasn't where your influence lived. Your influence was in synthesis, in letting enough data accumulate that the outcome became obvious without force. They began to understand that while they were busy reacting to each other, you were watching how reactions stack, how one choice narrows the next, how pressure reveals default settings, how people repeat themselves when they think no one is tracking the sequence. You didn't interrupt, because interruption would have protected them. It would have allowed correction, adjustment, narrative repair. You let continuity do the work. That's why when you finally acted, it didn't feel aggressive. It felt complete, not dramatic, settled, like something reaching its natural conclusion. They realized then that observation was never the point. Connection was. You weren't watching people. You were watching systems move through people. And systems don't respond to emotion. They respond to structure. You let the structure expose itself fully before touching it. That's why nothing unraveled afterward. No backlash. No chaos. No need to explain. The threads were already connected. All you did was acknowledge what was already true. And once truth is acknowledged at the structural level, debate loses relevance. They believed you were observing. They didn't see that you were quietly assembling the entire picture. And by the time they noticed, the picture was complete. After that, the environment recalibrated, without instruction. People didn't announce awareness. They adjusted posture, timing, risk. They spoke with less excess and acted with fewer assumptions. Not because you demanded clarity, but because clarity became evident. They realized that someone in the room wasn't responding to appearances anymore. Someone was tracking coherence. When coherence is being tracked, shortcuts stop working. They couldn't rely on charm to blur gaps. They couldn't rely on urgency to force decisions. They couldn't rely on volume to mask inconsistency. You didn't remove their options. You revealed which options lacked substance. And that realization changed behavior faster than confrontation ever could. Silence around you became deliberate. Not awkward, deliberate. Because they understood that silence wasn't a pause, it was processing. And processing at that depth makes noise feel reckless. They learned that every move now had continuity, that what they did today would still matter tomorrow. That sequence wasn't resetting. Once people feel sequence is being preserved, they stop improvising. They start choosing. That's the shift they felt and couldn't name. You weren't observing to judge. You were connecting to understand. And understanding, when complete, doesn't need speed. It needs alignment. That alignment is what made you unreadable to them in the end, not mysterious. Unreadable, in the sense that their usual instruments stopped working. They tried to anticipate reactions and found none. They tried to provoke response and met silence that held steady. They tried to rush resolution and discovered the system no longer accelerated on command, because you weren't operating on their timeline. You were operating on certainty. When someone connects invisible threads long enough, outcomes stop being options. They become conclusions. That's what people felt when dealing with you. Not resistance, resolution. The sense that whatever move came next had already been accounted for. That awareness softened urgency without inviting submission. It didn't inspire fear. It inspired restraint. People realized that reacting quickly around you was disadvantageous. That half-formed strategies dissolved the moment they touched a structure you could already see through. So they slowed, they measured, they hesitated. And in that hesitation, they revealed even more, because hesitation exposes priority. It shows what someone is reluctant to commit to. You didn't need to extract that information. It surfaced on its own. The invisible threads you connected weren't secret. They were just ignored by people too busy performing to notice them. You noticed because you weren't performing at all. By the time they understood this, their assumed edge had already faded. They realized that awareness doesn't announce itself when it's working correctly. It waits. It lets motion expose motive. It lets repetition reveal intent. They had assumed you were collecting impressions the way everyone else does. They didn't see that you were assembling relationships between events. You weren't interested in isolated moments because isolated moments mislead. People can perform once. They can improvise twice. They can even sustain a persona for a while. But they cannot maintain continuity. And continuity is where invisible threads become visible. You watched how one decision quietly constrained the next, how one excuse became the foundation for another, how confidence thinned when the same question appeared twice. None of this required attention from you. It required restraint, and restraint, when applied long enough, turns noise into signal. That's why your silence began to feel heavier over time. Not because it was threatening, but because it was unresolved. They could feel something forming without knowing what. And humans are uncomfortable when outcomes haven't declared themselves yet. You let that discomfort mature. You didn't rush to end it, because rushing would have protected them from seeing what they were building themselves. You let the system speak until it had nothing left to hide. That's when attempts to steer the situation quietly faded. Guidance relies on predictability. They had none with you, not because you were chaotic, but because you were complete. You didn't adjust your behavior to reactions. You didn't speed up when pressure increased. You didn't slow down when attention faded. You stayed anchored to the same internal sequence, and that consistency made external strategy ineffective. They realized that anything they tried next would simply reveal more about them than about you. Every move became revealing. Every adjustment exposed intent. And once that realization set in, effort felt wasteful. People conserve energy when they sense certainty. They stop pushing and start accommodating. That's what happened around you. Not submission, recognition. Recognition that someone in the room was no longer playing inside the moment but seeing through it. You weren't ahead of them by speed. You were ahead by position. You weren't looking at the board. You were looking at the structure the board sits on. And when someone operates from that level, reactions lose relevance. The system adjusts quietly, on its own. And that's where it ends. Without ceremony or resistance. Not because you imposed authority, but because the system finished revealing itself. They finally understood that you weren't waiting for the right moment to react. You were waiting for the moment when reaction wouldn't be necessary at all. Everything you needed to know had already surfaced through sequence, repetition, and alignment. The invisible threads weren't hidden. They were simply ignored by those who confuse motion with progress. You connected them because you refused to interfere while they were forming. And once connected, there was no need for further debate. No explanation to offer. People adjusted, because adjustment was the most reasonable response left. You didn't need their agreement. You didn't need acknowledgement. The outcome spoke quietly, and quiet outcomes tend to last. They believed you were observing because that's the highest level they knew how to name. They didn't realize you were integrating. And integration reshapes perspective without announcing itself. That's the final position. Not power that demands recognition, but awareness that makes recognition unnecessary. They now move differently, think differently, hesitate differently, long after the moment has passed, because someone once sat still long enough to see how everything connects. And once that's seen clearly, perception itself adjusts. What stays isn't the memory of you sitting quietly. It's the correction they carry forward. They don't rush conversations the same way anymore. They don't assume silence means lack of awareness. They don't mistake stillness for delay, something recalibrated in how they read situations. And that calibration stays active. They learned that the most consequential intelligence doesn't interrupt. It observes long enough for reality to expose its own seams. From that point on, they hesitate before filling gaps. They pause before over-explaining. They watch patterns a little longer instead of reacting to the first signal. Not because they're trying to imitate you, but because they felt the cost of not doing so. You didn't leave them with a story. You left them with a constraint, a quiet limit on how reckless interpretation can be. And that's why this endures over time. It doesn't need you present to keep working. It lives in behavior now, in restraint, in timing, in the awareness that someone once connected invisible threads simply by refusing to interfere. The most decisive influence doesn't compete for attention. It waits for structure to finish revealing itself. You didn't teach that rule. You embodied it. You didn't win an argument. You removed the need for one. You didn't dominate a moment. You allowed the moment to expose its own logic. And once people experience that level of clarity, they can't unlearn it. They carry it into other rooms, other situations, other decisions. Silence feels different now. By the time they saw it, there was nothing left to question. Everything had already settled. And what settled didn't fade. It became the quiet rule they operate by now. Hello, my dear masterminds. They expected clarity. The moment the expert arrived, that was the point of bringing him in. Someone with credentials, language, frameworks designed to reduce complexity into something manageable. They assumed you were complicated, not undefined, So they watched closely as he observed you, took notes, asked measured questions, tried to place you inside familiar categories, behavior patterns, motivations, predictable responses. That's how expertise works. It looks for reference points. What unsettled them was how quickly those reference points failed. You didn't contradict him. You didn't resist his process. You didn't try to influence the outcome. You answered without volunteering. You listened without absorbing. You reacted without revealing anything new. And the more data he gathered, the less confident he became. Not because you were evasive, because your responses didn't resolve into a profile. They didn't converge. They remained consistent without being narrow. That's what disrupted the framework. Experts rely on compression. They reduce complexity by finding the core driver. With you, every attempt to compress removed accuracy. The patterns didn't fold inward, they expanded. The more he looked, the less certain the structure became. He wasn't confused by contradiction. He was unsettled by coherence that didn't depend on expectation. You weren't performing for observation. You weren't adapting to being studied. You were operating from an internal order that didn't respond to external measurement. That's when the tone shifted. His questions slowed. His conclusions softened. He stopped offering explanations and started offering possibilities. And possibilities are what remain when certainty is gone. They brought him in to understand you. What they didn't expect was for him to leave questioning the limits of his own frameworks. The longer the expert stayed, the more the room changed. Not because of anything you said, but because of what stopped happening. The usual tells never appeared. No escalation under pressure. No contraction when silence stretched. No need to justify position or defend intent. He was trained to spot deviation. Instead, he found stability that didn't require reinforcement. Every time he tried to isolate a variable, it refused to behave independently. Your actions made sense only when viewed as part of a larger sequence. And even then, the sequence didn't point to control, fear, or ambition. It pointed to alignment. Not with people, not with outcomes, with something internal and self-sustaining that unsettled him more than unpredictability ever could. Unpredictable systems can be modeled statistically. Self-consistent systems that don't optimize for external reward cannot. He started revisiting his assumptions out loud, reframing questions, adjusting language. He noticed that the more neutral he became, the clearer you seemed. But clarity didn't translate into explanation. It translated into limits. Limits of interpretation. Limits of influence. Limits of expertise itself. By the time he stepped back, the conclusion wasn't that you were complex. It was that you weren't available to be reduced. And that realization didn't give them answers. It removed familiarity they relied on. That loss of familiarity marked a clear shift. They expected the expert to translate you into something usable, a label, a strategy, a handle they could hold on to. Instead, what he gave them was hesitation, not dramatic doubt, measured uncertainty, the kind that appears when someone realizes the tools they brought don't apply here. He explained that you weren't inconsistent. You were internally consistent in a way that didn't point outward, that your decisions didn't pivot around approval, threat, or reward. That made prediction unreliable, because prediction depends on leverage, and leverage depends on need. He couldn't locate yours. That's what unsettled him most. Not mystery. Absence. Absence of dependency. He admitted, carefully, that every framework he tried required you to want something from the structure observing you. You didn't. You were present without extraction, engaged without investment, responsive without alignment. That broke the feedback loop his analysis depended on. He left them with a warning, framed as a conclusion. Not that you were dangerous, but that you were outside conventional influence by the methods they understood. And being outside conventional influence doesn't mean chaotic. It means self-directed. The kind of self-direction that doesn't announce itself or demand recognition. It simply operates. They brought him in to understand you. What they got instead was a reminder that not everything meaningful can be categorized. Some things only reveal the limits of the observer. He didn't leave with a report. That's what unsettled them most. No clean summary. No decisive diagnosis. No list of traits they could circulate and feel oriented again. What he offered instead were qualifiers. Context. Silence where conclusions were supposed to be. He explained that studying you felt less like analysis and more like standing in front of something already complete. There was no process unfolding that he could interrupt, no arc he could influence by changing variables. Every attempt to provoke reaction returned the same result: calm, continuity, an absence of drift. He realized that most frameworks rely on instability to make sense of people, fluctuations, emotional spikes, behavioral tells. You gave none. That didn't make you unreadable. It made you settled, and settled states aren't something expertise is trained to handle. Expertise assumes movement, growth, correction. You weren't correcting. You weren't evolving in response to pressure. You were already aligned. And alignment at that level removes the need for explanation. That's why his confidence softened instead of sharpening. The deeper he looked, the more he understood the limits of interpretation. Not because you were hiding, but because there was nothing unfinished to uncover. They brought him in expecting mastery. He walked out carrying restraint. And that restraint spread. People stopped trying to solve you. They stopped expecting insight to give them leverage, because the one person trained to locate leverage had found none. And once that was understood, even quietly, the entire dynamic shifted. What followed was a subtle withdrawal, not from you, but from the idea that you could be managed. They didn't say it out loud, but behavior adjusted immediately. Fewer attempts to probe, fewer strategic conversations happening near you, less assumption that proximity meant access. The expert had done something unexpected. He hadn't decoded you. He had adjusted the room by acknowledging uncertainty. He removed the illusion that certainty was reachable here. And once that illusion disappeared, people stopped performing analysis and started respecting distance. Not emotional distance, structural distance. They understood that whatever guided you wasn't something they could influence by observation alone. You weren't reacting to scrutiny. You weren't adjusting under attention. You were operating independently of it. That independence carried weight. Not the kind that demands attention, but the kind that changes how people move around it. They no longer tried to extract meaning from your silence. They accepted that silence wasn't an absence of data. It was the close of the data cycle. The expert had shown them, without intending to, that some patterns don't reveal themselves through pressure. They reveal themselves through consistency. And consistency doesn't explain itself. It simply holds. They brought him in to understand you. What they ended up understanding was that some people aren't puzzles to be solved. They're reference points, and reference points don't answer questions. They orient everything around them. By the time that understanding settled, analysis no longer applied. The expert's uncertainty didn't create fear. It created restraint. People stopped assuming that insight would grant influence. They stopped believing that more observation would eventually produce direction, because what he revealed, without intending to, was that you weren't operating inside a loop. They could enter. You weren't responding to stimulus in a way that invited adjustment. You weren't shaping behavior to be read, anticipated, or steered. That meant every additional attempt to study you only reflected the same conclusion from a different angle. There was nothing to fix, nothing to use, nothing to intensify. You weren't withholding information. You simply weren't sourcing decisions from the environment observing you. And once people sense that, strategy loses urgency. Effort feels misdirected. They conserve energy instead of pressing forward. The dynamic doesn't fracture, it steadies around you. Conversations became simpler. Expectations narrowed. Assumptions stopped multiplying. Not because you demanded boundaries, but because boundaries revealed themselves naturally. You didn't need to defend your position. You didn't need to clarify intent. The expert had already demonstrated that intent wasn't something that could be extracted here. And when extraction fails, influence fades with it. They brought him in to understand you. What they learned instead is that some forms of clarity don't arrive as answers. They arrive as limits. And those limits don't invite challenge. They invite acceptance. That acceptance is where it settled for them, even if they never named it. They stopped trying to figure you out because they finally understood what the expert understood last. Understanding implies entry. With you, nothing opened because nothing was closed. You weren't guarded. You weren't concealing layers. You were whole in a way that didn't invite access. That completeness was what unsettled the room. Not confusion, recognition. Recognition that your center wasn't external. From that point on, people treated you differently without deciding to. They accounted for you instead of trying to manage you. They stopped assuming reaction and started assuming steadiness. Not because you dominated the situation, but because every attempt to analyze you returned the same result. Stability, coherence, independence from the observer. They brought in an expert expecting answers. What they faced instead was the natural end of the question itself. And when a question reaches its limit, pursuit slows on its own. You didn't outthink them. You didn't outmaneuver them. You didn't need to. You were operating from a position that made analysis unnecessary. That was the quiet conclusion they were left with. Some people can be studied. Some can be influenced. And some, when examined closely enough, only reveal where methods stop applying. What remained after that wasn't curiosity. It was restraint that never announced itself. They didn't revisit the idea of analyzing you later. They didn't tell themselves the expert missed something. That explanation didn't hold, because what shifted wasn't knowledge, it was orientation. From that point forward, you weren't treated as a subject to decode. You were treated as a fixed reference, and fixed references alter behavior without instruction. You didn't need secrecy. You didn't need explanation. You carried coherence that didn't depend on interpretation. The expert didn't leave confused. He left aware of a limit that examination couldn't cross without distortion. Awareness like that spreads quietly, not through discussion, but through behavior. Fewer probes, fewer assumptions, more space where space was appropriate, more care where care had once been unnecessary. You didn't intimidate anyone. You didn't dominate the room. You simply demonstrated that some people are not projects, not profiles, not problems to solve. They are internally ordered and unaffected by being observed. They brought in an expert to understand you. He left more reserved than before. And in that restraint, everyone else learned something that stayed. Some forms of clarity don't provide answers. They remove the expectation that answers are owed. Once that expectation fades, nothing presses forward anymore. They no longer mistake uncertainty for weakness, not after watching an expert pause instead of advance. They understood that uncertainty, in this case, wasn't confusion, it was accuracy. Accuracy about where influence ends. Accuracy about where observation stops helping. You weren't resistant. You weren't evasive. You were complete in a way that left no opening for intervention. That's why nothing followed the expert's departure. No second opinion, no escalation, no new approach. The structure recognized a limit and conserved energy. People stopped trying to interpret you because interpretation assumes permission. You never offered it. They learned that some individuals don't need to be understood to be accounted for. They only need to be recognized as operating from an internal order that doesn't adjust itself to external frameworks. You didn't silence the room. You clarified it. You didn't overpower analysis. You revealed where it no longer applied. They brought in an expert expecting direction through understanding. What they received instead was restraint. And restraint, once learned at that level, stays active without effort. It becomes automatic, unspoken, practical. That's where it settled. Not with answers, with a line no one tried to cross again. No one revisited the analysis. No one suggested another perspective. No one believed that more data would suddenly unlock what the expert couldn't place. The effort ended because effort stopped making sense. They understood that understanding isn't always a path forward. Sometimes it's the point where movement slows. You weren't unreadable because you were complex. You were unreadable because nothing about you was unfinished. There was no opening that closer attention could widen. No instability pressure could work on. That's why the expert stepped back. Not from failure, but from recognizing completion, where process was expected. And completion doesn't invite interpretation. It sets limits that don't need reinforcement. From that moment forward, interactions around you became simpler. People assumed less. They projected less. They stopped expecting access where none had ever been offered. You didn't have to protect your position. It protected itself. You were never inside their frameworks. And once a structure recognizes that, it stops arguing and starts adjusting quietly. What remained wasn't attention. It was calibration. People didn't circle back with curiosity or reopen the file. They didn't wonder what angle was missed. That instinct shut down. They learned that some clarity arrives not through answers, but through recognizing where inquiry no longer applies. From then on, behavior around you oriented itself without instruction. You weren't treated as a subject anymore. You were treated as a constant. And constants don't invite analysis. They shape movement. You didn't assert boundaries. You didn't defend anything. The limit revealed itself through coherence that never shifted under scrutiny. That's why it held, not because it was protected, but because it was accurate. The system learned where it could not go, and that learning stayed, not as tension, not as mystery, but as restraint. People approached you with fewer strategies and more precision. They assumed less. They filled fewer gaps. They moved with the understanding that whatever governed you wasn't available for negotiation. The expert's hesitation didn't weaken your position. It clarified it. It marked a natural stopping point. And stopping points like that don't announce themselves. They simply remain. You didn't become untouchable. You became irrelevant to control. Distance wasn't demanded. It became appropriate. Understanding wasn't missing. Access was. And that realization settled without noise. Completion that quietly defined the edge of everyone else's reach.